Welcome to Hope Looks Up Bible Study on Tuesday, October 22nd, 2024. Today we continue with our fall study series titled Jerusalem, the City of God in History and in Prophecy. Tonight's lesson is titled Jerusalem in Flux. We're continuing on with a lot of the history now following Jesus from last week. My name is Chuck Eaton. I'm pleased to host the Hope Looks Up Bible Study. We accomplish our mission by holding Bible studies in person and on YouTube. We provide complete study notes, and we send out the YouTube videos on Thursdays following each study session. The Hope Looks Up ministry mission is to form a ministry to give hope, encourage, educate, uplift, and point people to Jesus Christ for life direction. If you have questions or prayer requests, please fill out one of the forms on your table and we'll pick those up after the teaching. We now begin with a word of prayer. Dear Lord, join us on this beautiful day as we study your word in the Hope Looks Up Bible Study. Today's lesson continues our fall study of Jerusalem, the City of God. I pray blessings for those who have joined us today, both in person and in YouTube. Be with those who were unable to be with us and bring them back soon. Guide and bless our teacher, Dr. Tom Haney, as he leads us in these studies. May we discern what you have for us today, and may we share what we've learned with others. In Jesus' name, amen.
Well, I think one of the most interesting things about today's lesson and today's discussion is the fact that in our 2024, almost all the question revolves around the role of the Arabs and the Jews. And it all acts like it's just, that's the way it's always been. But we're going to find out today that the Arab connection with the nation of Israel, and especially with Jerusalem, didn't occur until kind of the time we're going to be talking about. Then it occurred for a lot of years. So I want to end today by talking about what does the Bible say about the prophecy about the Arabs. So I think that might be interesting for us to see too. I don't hear anybody discussing that. I do hear some people talking about what's the Bible say about Israel. I don't hear much of anybody ever talking about what's the Bible say about the Arabs. And so I think it's kind of interesting because God named Ishmael too, you know. He told Hagar that was the name to give him. God hears. So I think we'll have some interesting time as we share in all of this. Thank you for joining us on Hope Looks Up today. We welcome you in person or watching in YouTube. We'll continue to look historically at Jerusalem, even though at the time frame we're talking about, anytime after AD 30 for about 200 years, actually 500 years, there was no Jerusalem. You could not find a post office that said Jerusalem. There wasn't a zip code that led you to Jerusalem. There was only this renamed, rebuilt city that the Romans had, Aelia Capitolina. It was no temple, no synagogue, one little synagogue on Mount Zion, no churches, and the Jupiter temple was there. It was built with Roman, Greek, and Egyptian cultures and architecture. There was no Judea anymore. Hadrian had taken Judea, had destroyed it, and had renamed the whole thing Palestina. And so there was no Jerusalem, there was no Judea. Israel had disappeared almost 1,000 years before that, so it was gone as well. And not only had the Romans done that, they had forbidden the Jews to live in Palestine. The Old Testament glory seems totally gone. The New Testament prophecies about Jerusalem and the end times, the apocalypse, the beginning of the eternal city that contains heaven, Jerusalem, the new Jerusalem, seem like a pipe dream. But God's not finished with Jerusalem yet. And of course today we know we have a town named Jerusalem. Hadrian had destroyed over 75 Jewish settlements or towns and was so hated that in Jewish literature his name was never written without this addition: may his bones rot in hell. And the best rabbis or the worst rabbis, whoever it was, wrote that beside his name because of all the terrible things he had done to that nation and how much he had destroyed it and destroyed everything with it. Antonius Pius relaxed, the one who followed him, relaxed the persecution of the Jews a little, and he did re-permit them to have circumcision, but he also placed a statue beside one of Hadrian on the Temple Mount. So you just think in your mind, there's no Mosque of Omar, there's no Muslim temple, just on a big flat surface on top, there's 3 or 4 Roman emperors' statues. That's the whole worship of the Temple Mount at this point. And to emphasize the temple could not be rebuilt, or would not be rebuilt. Civil war broke out in Rome, and the result was the Jews actually sided with one of the ones fighting to be emperor who won, Septimus Severus. And he gave 2 plots of land to the Jews. This is the first thing they have owned since Babylon had destroyed Judea. One of them was up in the Golan area, the Golan Heights near Syria, and the other was in a small town, Lydda, which is, by the way, found in the New Testament as well, and it was near Jerusalem. He also allowed the Jews to reuse their calendar because they did not switch to a Roman calendar, so they could reuse their calendar and they could judge in religious cases in those new areas. We're talking about two little small areas. Archaeologists have shown in their diggings that Christians were going to Aelia Capitolina and secretly praying beneath the temple of Jupiter. Remember, he basically built it on the stone where the Christians felt Jesus had been killed, and built the Church of the Sepulchre. So they tore the Church of the Sepulchre down, built this temple of Jupiter there. The Christians were coming to that place and praying over that area. The Christians focused on a heavenly Jerusalem and considered the town of Aelia just an obscure place where Jesus had been crucified and resurrected. Diocletian took over Roman leadership in the area. He decided that Christians were the ones who were causing trouble. That's probably because they were more plentiful. And so he eased even more of the restrictions on the Jews, thinking they would be less trouble to the Romans. But the history of Jerusalem was all about to change. The Roman Empire was divided between 2 rulers. The ruler over the east and Jerusalem was a man named Galerius, and he continued to persecute Christians, very much more lenient on Jews. But the west leader was Constantius Chlorus, who soon died, but loved enough by all the people of the west that they made his son Constantine their leader. Constantine, like King David, would change the history of the world and the fate of Jerusalem in a single decision. Constantine was fighting to capture Rome. The 2 emperors that were trying to become the emperor, the 2 candidates, were fighting, and the night before the big battle, he had a vision. He saw in the sky the sign of a cross of light, and it was superimposed on the sun with the slogan, "By this sign you will conquer." So he emblazoned the shields of his soldiers with this Cairo symbol, and we've all seen it. It's kind of a straight up, and then it has an X at the bottom, and it has 2 circles at the top. Those are the first 2 Greek letters of the name for Jesus, the Chi and the Rho. And he won the battle. He believed he owed the power to the Christian supreme God. So Constantine pressed to have Christianity as the religion of the empire. As he conquered more territory, he embraced more Christian values. One of the things that he really liked was the elder and deacon system, and he felt that it paralleled somewhat the Roman Senate and the Roman ways of directing things. So his desire was to set up a organization of the Holy Roman government that would be over the entire world with a united faith, Christianity. And to some extent, a lot of that, what he wanted, happened with the Roman Catholic Church. In 323, Constantine called for a conference to solve the argument. It's hard to believe that was still going on 3 centuries after Jesus died. How human was Jesus? How divine was Jesus? Was he more human than divine, or was he more divine than human? Well, we all know what happened out of that. He was equally human and equally divine, is what they established. And basically the whole Christian world has accepted that and said that is true. Christ was fully human, he was fully divine. And so, but at that conference, was certainly an interesting thing happened, and that was that one of the bishops, the bishop of Aelia Capitolina, once Jerusalem, brought the fate of his little small town and the neglected town to Constantine's attention. Constantine decided to restore the city and create what Eusebius called the New Jerusalem, built over the one so famous of old. And Constantine commissioned a church that befitted Jerusalem as the cradle of the good news. With some family skullduggery, the mother of Constantine, Helena, won the opportunity to go to Jerusalem and carte blanche embellish Christ's city. She was very successful as an archaeologist. She came and she tore down this temple of Jupiter. Then she ripped up the floor of all the things that were under it, and there she found 3 crosses, actual nails, this is what the historians say, and a sign that read, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. My feeling is that the 3 centuries that Christ was dead and had risen from the dead, as the church made this spot a sacred spot, they saved these relics themselves. So if there were relics there, they were just all buried in the debris that the Romans had done when they started to build this temple. And so with that, she took the material from, she saved some, she shared some with others, and this started the desire of Christianity to collect holy relics. So we know that the shroud and the cup and the pieces of the cross, they said at one time if all the pieces of the cross had been put together that were supposedly off the cross of Jesus, would have made about 12 crosses, or maybe even a whole forest. You know, it was amazing. And it usually originated in Jerusalem. These came from Jerusalem, is what people said. She took the material from the leveled pagan shrines and ordered the filth thrown to its place, the Temple Mount, to show the failure of the Jewish God. She did not connect in any way the worship of the Jews with the worship of Jesus Christ, the Son of God and a Jew himself. Aelia had become a bustling Christian temple town, but the statue of the Roman emperors were still on the Temple Mount, and the Jewish heritage was held in contempt by the Romans and by the Christians. On July 19, 362, the new Emperor Constantine's nephew Julian, who was in Antioch on his way to invade Persia, asked a Jewish delegation, "Why do you not sacrifice?" And they said, "We're not allowed." "Restore to us the city, rebuild the temple and the altar." And Julian said to them, "I shall endeavor with utmost zeal to set up the temple of the Most High God." Well, his astonishing reply was greeted with such Jewish enthusiasm that it was as if the days of their kingdom had already arrived. And they considered this kind of the end times. Julian was going to rebuild the temple for them, everything would move ahead, the Messiah would come, etc., etc. He reversed the Hadrianic and Constantinian persecution of the Jews. He restored Jerusalem to them. He returned their property. He revoked the anti-Jewish taxes. He granted them power from taxation and the title Praetorium Perfect to their patriarch, or we would say probably priest today, Hillel. Jews poured into Jerusalem from all over Rome and Persian worlds to celebrate this miracle. His boast to rebuild the Jewish temple was a nullification of the Christian claim that they were now the true Israel, the chosen people. And by the way, we still have that argument going on today. There are still those who believe in replacement theology, that the church replaced Judaism, that the church replaced any contact there. And then we have the rest of us who think the Bible says God still works with the Jews, and he had the Gentiles for a Gentile period of time, and then he's going to put them all together. So some of these things, have lasted for a long time as far as how people have discussed them or what they have thought about them. But the Christians felt that they were the true Israel, a reversal in the minds they felt of the fulfillment of the prophecies of Daniel and Jesus, that the temple would be destroyed and it would fall. They never read anything about the new temples that would be built. So I guess Ezekiel, the end of Ezekiel, the third temple, or some of the Revelation which talks about the temple being rebuilt and the Antichrist setting up an image of himself, they just never applied these. They never took them as literal or as speaking about anything else that would happen. The people began to collect materials for the temple. They brought in dirt, was carried in. Donations paid were wood and stones that was stored to build it. And while Julian was fighting in Persia, his appointee to build the temple put a halt to the construction. And in May 363 AD, an earthquake hit Jerusalem. The temple materials were ignited and all burnt. Meanwhile, Julian was killed in a battle in Persia, and his successor, the commander of his guard, restored Christianity as the state religion, reversed Julian's acts. He also banned the Jews again from Jerusalem, and this was finalized when Theodosius I made Christianity the empire's official religion and started to enforce it. So the whole Roman Empire then had the official religion of Christianity. It was a strange time in Jerusalem, quite strange. Many wealthy women came and began to take over the shrine areas to beautify and sanctify them. Literally, there were dozens, and they gained great money. They did many things to improve these shrines of Christ, and this promoted an action in the town, the collection of spiritual relics, and the continuation of feasts and special days to celebrate the different parts of the life of Jesus. It contrasted with the one and only Jewish observance for the year. And if you follow Jewish history at all, you'll know that the 9th of Ab is considered their terrible day. And they can list dozens of things that happened, not just the destruction of the temple. But once a year, on the 9th of Ab, the Jews collected on the Temple Mount to commemorate the destruction of the temple. The tragedy of Jews' plight often redoubled their love for Jerusalem. The town was now much more Christian than Jewish in every way, except history and heritage. Theodosius II sent his wife, Eudocia, to be the empress of Jerusalem. She protected the Jews against the attacks by the Christians, and the Jews begged for access to the Temple Mount. And Eudocia gave them permission to visit the Temple Mount for their chief festivals. The Jews took this as a sign from God that they would rebuild the city, and sent messages to all the Jews that they should hasten to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, for their kingdom was about to be established. Well, you can imagine what this did. It provoked war. It provoked turbulence between the monastic monks, who, by the way, were at this point down in Sinai. They were in a series of places all over the Sinai Peninsula, and they held out that none of the Jewish shrines should ever be replaced, and these were championed who were championed by the Jews. So they really had a great influence, these monastic monks, even though hardly any of them lived in Jerusalem. The fate of Jerusalem after Eudocia was more persecution of the Jews, more churches built in Jerusalem. In the short period of 25 years, Jerusalem was ruled by Christians, then Zoroastrians from Assyria, then Jews, and finally Muslims. The result of all of this time was the chasing out of Christians by death and deportation, and 600 years after the temple had been destroyed, the royal boar, wouldn't you really like that title? He was the leader of Persia. I don't know how he gained that title. Anyhow, the royal boar, the leader of Persia, gave Jerusalem back to the Jews and restored the name of Jerusalem. Now it's going to fall into Christian hands and Muslim hands and no Jewish time, but it's going to fall into the hands of several people, but it doesn't ever change its name back. It is Jerusalem from the 6th century on, and that's that restoring the name. Actually, many people referred to it as Jerusalem even when it was Aelia Capitolina. So 3 times in this period of 600 years, the Jews had grasped moments of free prayer among the rock heaps of the temple. They had gone up on the Temple Mount in these rock heaps, the destruction, under Kokhba, under Julian, and under Custa. But Jews would not control the Temple Mount again for 1,300 years. One last Christian leader, Herculius, a Byzantine leader, captured the area, took a sacred shrine to the restored church in the Holy Sepulchre, and then returned to his throne in Byzantine. We would probably call that today the Orthodox capital, Constantinople. It was the people who were more in the Greece and Turkey area that were Christians. The next millennium in the life of Jerusalem mostly revolves around the Arab conquest of the city and the wars to liberate it from the Arabs. The life of Muhammad had one strong connection to Jerusalem. One night, his followers believe that as he slept beside his wife Kaaba, Muhammad, that's his first wife, Muhammad had a vision. The archangel Gabriel awoke him, and together they embarked on a night journey mounted on Burak, a winged steed with a human face, to the unnamed furthest sanctuary. There Muhammad met his fathers, Adam and Abraham, and his brothers, Moses, Joseph, and Jesus. These are the ones actually listed. Why they chose those five, I don't know, but that's what's listed in the Quran.
Before ascending by a ladder to heaven, unlike Jesus, he just called himself the messenger or apostle of God. He didn't claim any miraculous powers. Indeed, the journey, which is called the Isra, night journey, and the Miraj, or the Ascension, were his only miraculous exploits. Jerusalem and the temple are never actually mentioned in the Quran, but Muslims came to believe that the furthest sanctuary that Muhammad talked about was truly the Temple Mount. The Muslim leaders wanted to have Jerusalem under their control. They knew from the writings of the Jewish and Christian prophets that the Last Judgment would take place in Jerusalem. They believed the time of the Last Judgment was now, and they needed Jerusalem to have control over what was going to happen. They focused on a phrase from the Quran, "The hour has drawn nigh." Giving them the city was sealed with a covenant between Omar the Just, a Muslim, and the Monophysites of Christians who were up in Turkey. After signing the agreement, Omar set out for Jerusalem to claim it. The Christians didn't want to be in charge of Jerusalem anymore, so they basically just gave the city to the Muslims. The city was still overwhelmingly Christian. When the Muslims took control, and the Muslims shared the shrines then with the churches, and they shared the Temple Mount with the Jews, and for many years this sharing went on. Omar moved in many Arab families that enjoyed Jerusalem or were interested in it, and he also built the Gate Beautiful. They wanted to be by the Gate Beautiful to be the first to witness the Day of Judgment. He also encouraged Jews to return to the city. During the next 50 years of Muslim rule, the kingdom of Arabs was very precarious. Medina, Mecca, Iraq, and Persia were all controlled by rebel Arab groups. But it was during this time that the Arab Sultan, Abd al-Malik, built the Islamic jewel, or the crown of Jerusalem. He built the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. He took 7 years' worth of Egyptian revenues to build the Dome of the Rock. The plan was simple: a dome 65 feet in diameter, supported by a drum, all resting on octagonal walls. The beauty, the power, the simplicity are equaled only by its mystery. We do not know why Abdul al-Malak built it. He never said. It was not a temple, it was a shrine. The rock is considered as the site of Adam's paradise. In other words, it was the middle of the Garden of Eden. In their mind, it was considered Abraham's altar when he was sacrificing his son Isaac, and the place where David and Solomon planned the temple, later visited by Muhammad on his night journey. It was finished in 692 at AD, and it is used in an area that the Christians had avoided building. The Christians considered the temple and the things that had happened to Jesus and Paul in the temple as very negative, and it was not, in their mind, an appropriate place to have any special memories of Jesus. So they focused more on the garden tomb, the Church of the Sepulchre where Christ was crucified, and areas where Jesus had very positive events happen to him. Jerusalem now had a Muslim shrine in the dome, but not an imperial mosque, so Abdul al-Malik and his son Walid, who followed him, built the furthest mosque, as they called it, or Al-Aqsa. It was the Jerusalem mosque for ordinary Friday prayers, and it was at the southern end of the boundary of the Temple Mount. The Muslims, like the Jews and Herod, felt the Temple Mount was the centerpiece of Jerusalem. For the first time since AD 70, they built a great bridge crossing the valley for pilgrims to enter the Temple Mount from the west, over what is today called the Gate of the Chain and still in use. They also built the domed double gates for entry from the south. But like the Golden Gate, those were all enclosed with stones later by leaders of the city because of what they considered doctrinal issues with the Bible and Jesus coming. The Muslims have an elaborate end of time doctrine, and all of it takes place in and around Jerusalem. Because of that, there was a clear break between any Christian and Muslim sharing, but Jerusalem still remained overwhelmingly Christian. Within 50 years, the Muslim leaders banned the Jews from praying on the Temple Mount, a ban that is still in action today. And the Jews began to pray around the four walls of the Temple Mount, which today has turned into one wall, the Wailing Wall, and in a small cave at Warren's Gate that went directly under the Temple Mount near the Holy of Holies. Islam then took a turn towards a much more conservative and radical faith. This affected Jerusalem greatly. A new leader, Hakim, felt all Muslim-controlled lands should reflect only the most conservative of all Muslim teaching. And so that meant no more cooperative work was to occur with Muslims and Jews or Muslims and Christians. This led to the expulsion of Christians and Jews from the town, and it became a Muslim destination. Because Mecca and Medina were still controlled by Arab rebels, Muslim leaders began to flock to Jerusalem, and it was considered one of the three great Muslim destinations as a shrine. This changed over the next 200 years as Mecca and Medina were freed and came under Muslim control, and therefore became the center place of Muslim faith because that's where Muhammad lived, and that's where he did most of his teaching and his ministry. And Jerusalem slipped into a great state of decline and mediocrity. That changed, though. It changed because the Crusades changed it. Europe suddenly had a taste for reclaiming the city of Jerusalem. They wanted to make it a Christian city once again, and that became an extremely popular thing in Europe. It was led by the kings and the nobles and the knights. It was given papal blessings. It was funded by almost all the Christians in Europe, from the wealthy to the poorest. And from the period from 1100 to 15 AD, saw the city controlled by Romans, also called Byzantines, and they set up a series of kings and queens, even though they weren't always in charge of the city. But they had a king appointed over Jerusalem, or at times it was a queen, much like we see in today's England, the following just if there are male heirs or if there are only female heirs. And the Turks then were also followed from either Constantinople or the Turks that were Muslim Turks. And it was always remained a Jewish remnant. But during these greater times of Muslim persecution and occupation, it had very few Christians who stayed in the city. They mostly just came from Europe on the days of the special holidays, the pilgrimages on the holy days. Today that's still true. Christmas and Easter are celebrated by many Christians by going to the Holy Land. And it led to provoking fighting and killing in the city. But Jerusalem was primarily a Muslim-controlled city and would stay that way until the Turkish Ottoman Empire and the Greek or Orthodox Church would battle the Muslims for control of Jerusalem later. This leads to one of the burning issues today as the world debates and seeks to decide who does Jerusalem really belong to. It shapes a lot of the diplomatic activity in the Middle East. Because the Arabs occupied the country for over 1,000 years, there's a lot of feeling that they should have control of the nation. The Jews never controlled it, either Christians or Muslims, during the last 1,500 years. So the question is, what about the Arabs? One of the things we need to realize is appropriate love for Israel and the Jewish people does not negate love for the Arab people, many of whom are also descendants of Abraham, and many of them through his sons and grandsons. Isaac received the covenant blessing and gave to his son, Jacob, or Israel, the blessing, but Ishmael, Esau, Isaac's other son besides Israel, and the sons of Keturah were also Abraham's heirs. They were sons and grandsons of Abraham. They too must be considered when we hear the promises that God made to Abraham. When the Bible says in Genesis 12, 2 and 3, I'll make you into a great nation, I will bless you, I'll make your name great, you will be a blessing, I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all peoples on the earth will be blessed through you. Isaiah understood prophetically that in the future time in history, The Arab nation would be a blessing to the whole earth. I would encourage you to look up Isaiah 19 through 25, to just see how that is said in prophecy. Well, then we might ask ourselves, why such hostility? Why would the two descendants of Abraham have such hostile reactions to each other today? Ishmael, kind of the father of the Arabs, and Isaac, the father of the Jews. Well, Abraham's wife Sarah had the idea that she should build a family by giving her handmaiden Hagar, the Egyptian, to Abraham. As soon as Hagar found out that she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress, is what it says in the Bible. Verse 4, Genesis 16. Then when Sarah mistreated her because she felt her son Ishmael was mistreating Sarah's son Isaac, she fled, and the angel of the Lord found Hagar and gave her the prophetic word about her future descendants. Through her son Ishmael, here's what the angel said. Hagar is still expecting. Ishmael has not been born yet. And she says, the angel said, I will so increase your descendants that they will be too numerous to count. You are now with child, and you will have a son. You are to call his name Ishmael, which means God hears, and she did. For the Lord has heard of your misery. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him, and he will live in hostility toward all of his brothers. Verses 10 through 12 of chapter 16 of Genesis. There could hardly be a more accurate description of the history of the Middle East than what Gabriel told Hagar. Yet Ishmael too was to receive a blessing, for he, along with Abraham, received in his flesh the mark of the covenant. When God asked Abraham to make circumcision the covenant sign for his peoples, his tribe, Abraham received that mark in the flesh at age 99, and Ishmael was 13. God promised Abraham that he would establish an everlasting covenant through his yet-to-be-born son Isaac, Sarah's firstborn, but he assured Abraham that Ishmael and his descendants would also be blessed. When Abraham asked God what would happen to Ishmael and could you give him a blessing? And here's what God said. He told Abraham, as for Ishmael, I've heard you. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers or tribes, and I will make him into a great nation. Genesis 17:20. Yes, amid all that turmoil in the Middle East, there's a chosen destiny for the Arab nations and a brotherhood between Arabs and Jews to be reclaimed. Ishmael and Isaac, you see, were together at the death and the burial of their father, and they were getting along just fine. The Ishmaelites married offspring of David when David was a king of Israel, and all of them served together in the court of King David. Are there specific prophetic promises made to the Arabs and the sons of Ishmael? Yes. The sons of Ishmael and Israel's neighbors figure significantly into God's end-time plans. Isaiah described a time yet in the future when Egypt and Assyria, along with Israel, will be a blessing on the earth. What was Assyria in Isaiah's day? It was an area that includes all the southern part of Turkey, almost all of Iraq, and all of Syria today. By substituting the names of these present-day countries, we come up with a remarkably prophetic scripture as it relates to today's Arab world. Here's what it says. In that day, an expression often used to denote the time of the end, there will be an altar to the Lord in the heart of Egypt, and a monument to the Lord on its border. It will be a sign and a witness to the Lord Almighty in the land of Egypt. The Lord will make himself known to the Egyptians, and in that day they will acknowledge the Lord. In that day there will be a highway from Egypt to Assyria, Turkey, Iraq, and Assyria. The Egyptians and the Assyrians, Turks, Iraqis, and Syrians, will worship together. In that day Israel will be the third, along with Egypt and Assyria, Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, a blessing on the earth. The Lord Almighty will bless them, saying, and I just want you to catch how this ties together prophetically. Blessed be Egypt, my people, he says. Assyria, my handiwork. That's Turkey, Iraq, and Syria. And Israel, my inheritance. That's Isaiah 19 through 25. Well, as we continue on in the study of Jerusalem, we're going to come to that point where everything begins to work towards the Muslims and the Ottoman Empire at odds over Judea and Israel and Jerusalem. And we're going to move ourselves into the modern 2 or 3 centuries that shape the rebirth of Israel. I hope you'll join us next week.
Thank you, Tom. What a history lesson we're receiving, and it sure makes Jerusalem a lot more part of our Christian beliefs. Well, thank you for coming. I'll be posting tonight's lesson on the Hope Flux Up YouTube site on Thursday. Notes will be distributed on Sunday, and prayer time will begin now. Linda?